One Piece, 1152. Spoilers: Shanks' true identity revealed. One Piece manga spoilers 1152 appear quite early, and the chapter itself presents a hint that Shanks is indeed no ordinary figure. The fight against the Holy Knights is still ongoing, and for the first time we also see the power of Im. He apparently has the ability to turn someone into a demon. However, interestingly, Loki decides to join Luffy. After a weekly break, One Piece manga is finally back for this week. So, what happened in this chapter? First, the title for One Piece chapter 1152 is titled Terrible Day. One Piece chapter 1152 opens with a moment where Skapper Gaban mentions to Luffy that the Holy Knights are not actually invincible. What needs to be done is Luffy needs to improve his Conqueror's Haki ability. Gaban also stated that in the Straw Hat crew, there is actually another figure who also has the Haki ability. Sanji himself had suspected that Gaban was talking about him. However, Gaban was actually talking about Roronoa Zoro. Luffy also admitted that he knew that Zoro had Conqueror's Haki. Sanji himself had suspected that Gaban was talking about him. However, Gaban was actually talking about Roronoa Zoro. Luffy also admitted that he knew that Zoro had Conqueror's Haki. However, it turned out that Loki himself rejected the idea. Not only Loki, Zoro and Sanji also stated that they did not agree with the idea. Gaban himself then began to tell about the events of decades ago to Harudin, Luffy, and Loki that he and Shanks were in Elbaf when the terrible event that happened to King Harold occurred. A flashback moment then appeared about 14 years ago, where Loki was seen going to the Elbaf Palace to ask King Harald why he decided to join and cooperate with the world government. For Loki, the world government is the party that killed his idol pirate, Roxty Zebek. However, when he arrived at the palace, he found something terrible, where King Harold was killed by his own troops. Meanwhile, Shanks had told Gaban that he had met King Harold and said that one day he wanted to meet again. Shanks is also known to have the Abyss symbol on his hand when he met Gaban. However, a mysterious figure then appeared and stole the legendary Devil Fruit in Elbaf. At the end of the chapter, we get another flashback story, where the timeline itself is 109 years ago. In the flashback, it is shown how the young King Harold was shown to be rampaging in a human kingdom. One Piece 1152 spoilers confirm the speculation that has been developing among fans regarding the figure of Loki. Although at first Loki was shown and introduced as an evil and terrible figure who could threaten the entire world, in reality he is not the figure as suspected by the other giants. Loki is considered not an evil figure who killed his own father. It was later proven that it was not actually Loki who did it, but his own troops. How Loki could then be considered the one who killed King Harold was most likely because he came at the wrong moment. In this case, he appeared when King Harold's troops were being killed by his own troops, and Loki likely had to survive. Most likely at that time, Im-sama, using the Domi Reversi technique, turned King Harold's troops into demons. He then controlled them all to kill King Harold. It could also be the other way around, where Im controlled King Harold until he went berserk and made the royal troops finally have to act where they killed the king. Because he came at the wrong moment, Loki was eventually considered the one who killed King Harold and his entire army. On the other hand, It is also interesting to know how King Harold actually made a deal with the world government. This also confirms other speculations from fans who previously mentioned that King Harold could have a deal with the world government. This is based on the statements of the Holy Knights, who seem to be familiar and know the figure of King Harold, thus raising speculation that the leader of Elbath is likely affiliated with the world government. However, it is still unconfirmed whether King Harold made a deal for the position of Holy Knight, as they did with the figure of Loki before. On the other hand, did King Harold do it consciously, or was it controlled by him? This question arises because there is a contradiction where King Harold is depicted as a figure who is widely worshipped, even though he is not perfect. On the other hand, he also tries to be better by cutting off the two horns on his head, which are the sign of the ancient giants. This is certainly interesting and worth looking forward to. Luffy fans must still remember one of the most iconic moments, where Shanks decided to sacrifice his arm for Luffy. At that time, Shanks's left arm was eaten by the Sea Kings. At first glance, there was nothing strange about the moment, and it seemed like Shanks made a sacrifice to save Luffy. He also mentioned that what he did was a gamble for the future. However, from the One Piece 1152 spoiler itself, it was finally revealed that what Shanks did was indeed intentional. Shanks turned out to be no ordinary figure where on his arm there was an abyss mark, or a mark belonging to the world government. What Shanks then did with his arm was likely that he did not want to be part of the world government. Shanks himself has been different from his family since childhood, especially his twin brother Figureland, Shamrock. If Shamrock is part of the Holy Knights, then Shanks has been part of Roger's pirate group since childhood. In the 4 billion booklet itself, it is revealed that Shanks was accidentally found by Roger after the Great War of God Valley. Shanks is in a treasure chest. How Shanks ended up in the treasure chest is still a big question until now. However, one interesting thing is that Shanks also has the abyss mark on his arm, like his twin brother. Considering that Shanks is part of the Figarland family, this makes sense. On the other hand, this means that some parties have indeed inherited Im's power since he was a child. The moment Shanks cried in Roger's arms when he returned from Laugh Tale is still a question. However, it is possible that what Roger said was related to who he really was that made Shanks finally get a mission from the captain. One of them could be to find someone who will continue the journey, or other missions carried out by Roger that he could not do. Seeing this, it is not impossible if we then see a moment where Shanks will fight against his own family. Also, besides that, Shanks will also likely be shown fighting Im at the end of the story, maybe even much sooner. The moment of Im's fight against Shanks will certainly be one of the most epic fights in the One Piece story. Arigato gozaimasu. Thanks a lot for watching.